It begins in a kitchen. About 70 men, sweating and desperate, are clutching heavy meat cleavers and sharpened bread knives. They are not chefs preparing a feast. They are slaves who have realized that they are being hunted. They know that in a few minutes, they will either be free or they will be dead. Moments before this, these same men were meant to fight each other for sport. To kill for cheers. To bleed for coins. Now they are turning their blades toward the people who own them. This is where the story of Spartacus truly begins. Before he was a legend. Spartacus was not born a slave. He was a free man from the wild lands of Thrace, a soldier who had once fought alongside the Romans as a hired fighter. He knew their tactics, he knew their language, and he knew their weaknesses. But somewhere along the line, the system swallowed him. He was captured. One moment you are a free man with a sword. The next, you are a thing with a price. Spartacus was sold into slavery and ended up in a place called Capua, a wealthy city north of Pompey, chained inside the Lentulus Batiatus gladiatorial school. Now, don't let the word school fool you. This wasn't a place of learning. It was a prison for fighting men. The owner, Batiatus, had invested a fortune in these men. They were assets. And like any expensive piece of equipment, they were locked up tight, fed just enough to keep them strong, and trained to kill each other for the public amusement. In the year 73 BCE, about 200 of these men decided they'd rather die fighting for air than die bleeding for applause. They planned a breakout. A conspiracy. But secrets in a prison are like smoke, they always find a way out. Someone betrayed them. The guards came rushing in, chains rattling, ready to crush the rebellion. The revolt was supposed to die before it was born. In the chaos, around 70 to 78 men broke away. They did not have swords. They grabbed kitchen knives. Cleavers. Whatever they could grab. Cooking tools became weapons. Hunger turned into fury. They stormed the guards. Steel met flesh. Doors flew open. Chains fell away. As they burst out into the streets of Capua, fortune finally smiled on them. They seized a wagon. It was filled with crates of real gladiatorial armor, shields and blades meant for the arena. They threw away their kitchen tools and buckled on the iron of the professional killer. 3 men emerged as the heart of this movement. There was Spartacus, the Thracian with the mind of a general. Beside him stood Crassus, a giant of a man from Gaul who carried a burning rage that could not be put out. And then there was Licinius, another brave soul from the north. They were a diverse group of strangers, men who spoke different languages and worshipped different gods, united only by the heavy scars on their backs. They had done the impossible. They had broken out of the strongest cage in Italy. But as they looked back at the walls of Capua, they realized they had no home to go to, no food to eat, and an entire empire was about to wake up and realize that the wolves were loose in the garden. They were free, but they were also the most wanted men in the world, and Rome did not like to lose its property. The fugitives from Capua climbed a mountain. Mount Vesuvius. It was the perfect hiding spot. Steep slopes. Dense forests. And most importantly, only one known path to the top. From above, they could see everything coming from a mile away. The Romans called this the Gladiator War. They sent a praetor named Gaius Claudius Glaber with 3,000 men, not real legionaries, but militia, raised in a hurry. Glaber's job was simple: march to Vesuvius, starve the slaves out, and go home to a hero's welcome. Glaber and his men camp at the base of mountain, blocking the only path down the mountain, essentially trapping their prey at the top. Then he waited. No food could go up. No water. No hope. In a few days, the slaves would come down weak and desperate, and his men would overpower them. It was a perfect plan. Against anyone who followed the rules. That night, Spartacus' men cut the vines, twisted them into ropes, and lowered themselves down the cliff. Not the path. They carried their swords in their teeth. They moved in silence. And when they hit the ground, they didn't run away. They circled behind the Roman camp. Then, they strike. Glaber's men wake up to screams. Tents collapse. Shields fall. Roman soldiers stumble out half-dressed into a storm of blades. What was meant to be a quiet siege becomes a slaughter. The camp was overrun in minutes. Glaber himself barely escaped with his life, running into the night without his armor, without his dignity. As news of this victory rippled through the Italian countryside, slaves heard the whispers. A Thracian. A gladiator. He beat a Roman praetor. He's free. And he's recruiting. They came in droves. Field slaves who had spent their lives in chain, household servants who had been treated worse than oxen, shepherds, and even some poor free men who had lost everything to the wealthy elite. They brought nothing but their hunger for freedom. The Roman Senate, now realizing that Glaber had failed miserably, sent a more serious commander named Publius Varinius. Varinius thought he could crush them easily. He sent his lieutenants, Furius and Licinius, to hunt the rebels down. Spartacus pretends to retreat looking weak. Then, when Furius overextended, confident and careless, Spartacus turned and smashed him. Days later, he caught Licinius bathing in a stream, a general relaxing while his men did the work. In the final insult, he captured the general's own horse and his fasces, the ceremonial bundles of rods and axes that represented the absolute power of the Roman law. The Roman commander barely escapes on foot. Through that winter of 73 to 72 BCE, they built something in their hidden camps. Blacksmiths who had once made tools for Roman farms now forged swords. Tanners made leather armor. Women who had been household servants became the backbone of a moving city. And traders, likely pirates from Cilicia, maybe local merchants who saw profit over patriotism, did business with the rebels. Weapons for food. Information for gold. The rebel force had swelled to a staggering 70,000 people. They were no longer a small raiding party, they were a city on the move. The Roman Senate finally looked at each other and admitted the truth. This wasn't a gladiator war. This was a rebellion. And it was growing. Spartacus stared north. Toward the Alps. He knew that 70,000 people cannot hide forever. And he knew that Rome, humiliated, would not send another praetor. Next time, they would send the consuls. 2 roads stretch out in front of the rebel army. One leads north, toward cold mountains and freedom. The other leads south, toward Rome. A massive rift opened up between the leaders. On one side stood Spartacus. He wants to go north, over the icy, jagged peaks of the Alps, and let every man and woman walk back to their old lives in Thrace or Gaul, where Roman law cannot reach. But on the other side was Crassus, the Gallic giant. Crassus and 30,000 of his followers wanted to stay. They wanted to march on the city of Rome and burn the city that chained them to ash. It is about payback. This ego and anger led to a fatal mistake. Crassus and his 30,000 warriors, mostly Gauls and Germans, broke away from the main group and marched south. Spartacus, with the rest, continued north toward the mountains. It was exactly the opening the Roman Senate had been waiting for. In the capital, panic had finally given way to action. The Senate realized this wasn't a slave problem anymore. This was a war. They dispatched the highest authority in the Republic, the consuls themselves. 2 men. Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus. They brought 4 legions. 40,000 trained Roman soldiers. Near a place called Mount Garganus, the Romans caught up with Crassus. The Gauls stood their ground but were overwhelmed. Crassus fought with everything he had, but he was killed on that battlefield, and 30,000 of his men were slaughtered beside him. The dream of revenge had turned into a mass grave. With Crassus dead, they moved to trap Spartacus. Lentulus moves ahead of him, blocking his path in the north. Gellius comes from behind, chasing him like a wolf. Spartacus and his men were trapped between 2 massive Roman forces. Most generals would have panicked. Spartacus saw opportunity. He hurled his entire force at Lentulus, the army blocking his path. Before Gellius could catch up, Lentulus was broken, his legions scattered. Then Spartacus did the unthinkable. He wheeled his exhausted army around and marched straight back toward Gellius. Gellius, marching forward, confident in his victory, walked straight into a buzzsaw. His legions were shattered in a matter of days. Spartacus defeated the 2 consular armies. He had humiliated the highest power in Rome. To honor his fallen friend, Spartacus held funeral games for Crassus. He took 300 high-ranking Roman prisoners and forced them to fight to the death as gladiators. It was a brutal act of respect for his fallen brother. For one afternoon, the masters were the entertainment, and the slaves were the audience. Then, at the height of his power, Spartacus did something that historians still argue about today. He was at the foot of the Alps. The path to the north was open. He could have crossed those mountains and vanished into history as the men who got away. But instead, he turned south. Maybe the mountain passes were already choked with winter snow. Maybe his army, now massive and carrying tons of looted treasure, was too slow to make the climb. Or perhaps, after watching Crassus die and then crushing 2 Roman armies, his men finally got what they wanted. They weren't ready to leave. They wanted more plunder. They wanted to hurt Rome. When 2 consular armies fall to slaves, panic grips the capital. Rome was terrified. In their desperation, the Senate turned to the only men who could afford to buy them a victory, Marcus Licinius Crassus. The richest man in Rome and perhaps the most ruthless. The Roman Senate gave Marcus Licinius Crassus 8 legions, numbering around 40,000 to 50,000 men. But there was a problem. These weren't fresh troops. Many were survivors of Spartacus' previous victories. They were demoralized. They were haunted. They were more afraid of a Thracian sword than they were of their own commanders. The breaking point came with a man named Mummius. Crassus had sent him to shadow Spartacus with strict orders: observe. Do not engage. Mummius ignored him. Seeking glory, he attacked, and his unit was decimated. They fled in a blind panic, throwing down their shields and running for their lives. Crassus looked at his army and saw a sickness, cowardice. He decided to cut it out. He revived an ancient punishment, one so cruel that Rome hadn't used it in generations. A ritual known as decimation. Crassus took 500 of the men who had fled and divided them into groups of 10. In each group, the men drew lots. The man who lost was beaten or clubbed to death by his fellow soldiers right there, in front of the entire army. Crassus had sent a message: fear Crassus more than you fear the enemy. With this new, terrified army, Crassus began to hunt. He pushed the rebels further and further south, down into the very toe of the Italian boot, a narrow peninsula called Bruttium. Spartacus was backed up against the sea. He looked out over the blue sea toward the island of Sicily, thinking if he could just get his people across, they could restart the flame of rebellion there. He struck a deal with Cilician pirates, paying them a fortune in gold to ferry 2,000 of his best men across the strait. But pirates are loyal only to the wind. They took the gold and sailed away. Spartacus stood on the shore and watched his last hope disappear over the horizon. The pirates had betrayed him. Crassus saw his chance to end the war without ever swinging a sword. He ordered his men to build. Across the narrow peninsula where Spartacus was trapped, they dug a ditch from sea to sea. 40 miles long. 15 feet wide. Behind it, they raised a wall fortified with watchtowers and palisades. It was a fortress, built to cage an army. Spartacus tried to break out. He launched assaults, day after day. His men threw themselves at the wall, and Roman javelins threw them back. Food ran low. Hope ran lower. Winter set in, and the rebels huddled against the stone, trapped in the toe of Italy, waiting to starve. On one freezing, stormy night, while the wind howled and the snow blinded the Roman guards, Spartacus made his move. His men didn't just climb the wall, they filled the deep trench with anything they could find: earth, timber, and even the frozen bodies of dead animals. They created a bridge of flesh and wood and charged through. They climbed over the wall, poured through the gap, and vanished into the darkness. About a third of the army broke out, racing east toward the port of Brundisium. They were running for the sea, desperate for any ship that would take them away from this cursed land. Crassus stood before his broken wall and felt the victory slip through his fingers. And worse, Rome is sending rivals. Pompey the Great is marching back from Spain. Lucullus, the conqueror of the Eastern Kingdom, is landing in the east. If they crush Spartacus first, Crassus will lose the glory he bled for. Spartacus marched hard for Brundisium. But when he arrived, he saw the sea filled with sails. Lucullus' men was already there. His legions were disembarking. The port was locked. Two of the greatest generals Rome had ever produced were sailing toward Spartacus from opposite directions. Somewhere in the upper Salaris River valley, the end finally arrived. Spartacus knew this was it. Before the battle began, he called his men together. In front of his men, he did something unforgettable. He called for his horse, a fine animal, captured from a Roman general. Then, in full view of his army, he drew his sword and drove it into the horse's neck. The animal crumpled. Spartacus stood over it, blood on his hands, and spoke. "If we win, I will have plenty of horses. If we lose, I won't need one." It was his way of saying, "Today, we fight. Today, we don't run. Today, we win or we die together." The final battle was a meat grinder. This was not a tactical masterpiece, it was a scream of pure rage. Spartacus fought like a man possessed, hacking his way through the Roman ranks. He wasn't trying to win anymore, he was trying to reach and kill Crassus with his own hands. He cut down 2 high-ranking Roman officers, but the tide of steel was just too much. They surrounded him. They wounded him. And finally, they cut him down. But here is where Spartacus becomes a legend. In the chaos and the blood, his body was never found. Crassus wanted to parade him through Rome, but he couldn't. The Thracian simply vanished into the red mud of the battlefield, becoming a ghost before the fighting was even over. The rebellion was annihilated. Crassus had won his war, but his moment of glory was immediately stolen. Pompey the Great had intercepted 5,000 rebels fleeing the battle. They were starving and exhausted. Pompey slaughtered them and then sent a letter to the Senate. He claimed that while Crassus had beaten the slaves, he, Pompey, had pulled up the war by the very roots. Crassus was furious about Pompey stealing his credit. He wanted to send a message. He wanted to make sure that no slave would ever dream of freedom again. So, he took 6,000 prisoners. And he marched them to the Appian Way, the main road leading straight into the heart of Rome. There, he had them all crucified. For over 100 miles, from Capua to the gates of the city, the road was lined with a forest of wooden crosses. 6,000 men were left to rot in the sun, their bodies hanging as a gruesome warning to every traveler, every merchant, and every slave who passed by. The message was simple: this is the price of rebellion. The war was over, the status quo had been restored. The Roman Republic returned to its business of conquering the world and building an empire. But for one brief, shining moment, just a few years, a group of men with kitchen knives had made the masters of the world tremble in their silk robes. Spartacus was gone. His body was never found. The Servile War was over. But 6,000 crosses could not make Rome forget his name. Crassus won the war, but Pompey won the glory. The stage was now set for a rivalry that would destroy the Roman Republic. If a man with a kitchen knife can make the Roman Empire tremble, imagine what you can do by just hitting that like button. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, smash that like button right now, it helps more history fans find the channel. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. And drop a comment below: if Spartacus had reached Crassus in the battle, do you think he could have killed him? I want to read your comment. Subscribe now, and stay historical.